The restaurant shimmered under golden lights, its marble floors reflecting every crystal glass and silver fork. I hadn't planned to be here tonight, but my daughter insisted, saying it was a special gathering with her friends. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I was merely a prop in her evening, an accessory to the image she wanted to project. She greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek, her eyes already flicking back to the group at the corner table. As I took my seat, conversation around me flowed with the casual arrogance of youth, travel plans, expensive gadgets, the latest designer labels. I was content to sit quietly, sipping water, listening. Then she leaned back in her chair, her voice just loud enough to carry across the table. "Dad's broke," she said with a grin. "He can't even afford a decent phone." Laughter rippled among her friends, sharp and effortless, like glass breaking. One of them glanced at my phone on the table and chuckled. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I let the noise wash over me, as if I were a guest at a performance I'd seen too many times before. Inside, I felt the familiar ache, not for my pride, but for the years I had traded away to make sure she never had to taste struggle. The nights I worked until my back stiffened. The mornings I left before sunrise so she could wake to a house filled with warmth and certainty. All of it invisible now, replaced by the simple label of broke. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries more weight than words, and reached for my glass. She saw it, but mistook it for resignation. What she didn't notice, what none of them noticed, was the black leather briefcase resting quietly by my chair. It sat there like a shadow, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but heavy with a truth none of them could guess. The conversation shifted to something else, their laughter still bright, their world still small. I stayed still, letting the briefcase's handle brush against my leg, its presence a quiet reminder. Sometimes the most powerful answers aren't given in the moment. They arrive later, when no one is laughing. There was a time when my days began before the sun even touched the horizon, when I would step into my small office with nothing but a stubborn dream and a worn-out notebook filled with ideas. I built my business the way a mason builds a wall, brick by brick, year after year, through storms and droughts alike. There were no shortcuts, no windfalls, only long hours, calloused hands, and a quiet refusal to give up. In the early years, I slept in the back room of my shop, surviving on coffee and determination. Every deal I made was carefully weighed, every risk measured twice before I took it. Slowly, those modest deals grew into contracts, the contracts into partnerships, and the partnerships into something much larger, a quiet empire that stretched far beyond my own city. My name, though, rarely appeared in the papers. That was by choice. When the time came, I sold the company for a figure that could have rewritten anyone's life. The transfer was discreet, handled by lawyers who valued silence over spectacle. I invested the money with the same patience I had used to earn it, planting it in places where it could grow quietly, far from prying eyes. I could have bought the houses, the cars, the vacations that people use as billboards for their success. But I knew what came with that. The insincere smiles, the phone calls from friends who suddenly remember your birthday, the relatives who think your fortune is theirs by blood. So I chose a simpler life. I wore the same well-pressed shirts, drove a modest car, and ate at small restaurants where no one cared who sat at the next table. I found peace in knowing that my wealth wasn't a costume I wore for the world's approval. It was a foundation, one I could stand on without needing applause. My daughter never asked about those years. She never wondered why her school fees were paid without delay, why her birthdays always came with gifts she'd only half hinted at wanting, why there was never a moment in her childhood when the lights didn't work or the fridge wasn't full. To her, my simplicity was proof of limitation, not choice. She mistook absence of display for absence of means. And perhaps I let her believe it. Not out of malice, but because I wanted her to learn that the value of a person was never measured in the shine of their possessions. She never learned that lesson. Not yet. But the time was coming. And when it did, she would see that the man she called broke had simply been choosing which truths to show, and which to keep waiting. The menus were leather-bound and heavy, the kind of weight meant to remind you that everything on them came at a price. My daughter sat at the head of the table like a hostess in her own kingdom. Her friends clustered around her in a cloud of perfume and confidence. Without glancing my way, she waved the waiter over and began ordering lobster, imported steaks, a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's weekly wages. Every choice was loud, theatrical, meant to impress. When the waiter's eyes finally flickered to me, I offered a simple nod. "Just coffee," I said. The words hung in the air for a second too long. My daughter seized the moment, her lips curling into a smirk. "Don't worry," she announced, her voice carrying easily over the hum of the room. "I'll cover Dad's coffee. It's all he can afford." Laughter erupted again, but this time it was sharper, a little meaner. One of her friends raised a phone, angling it to catch my face in the frame, as if my quiet presence was some kind of joke worth sharing with the world. I felt the lens on me, the way you feel the sun when it's too close, but I didn't look up. Instead, I stirred my coffee slowly, the silver spoon clicking softly against the porcelain. I watched the steam curl upward, listened to the rhythm of their laughter, the scrape of cutlery against plates already laden with excess. Every detail went into a quiet file in my mind, not for revenge, but for timing. I sipped, unhurried, letting the heat settle on my tongue. From where I sat, I could see the reflection of the table in the restaurant's mirrored wall, her gestures exaggerated, her friends leaning in as if every word she spoke was gold. In that reflection, I looked like what she wanted them to see, small, unremarkable, harmless. Inside, though, I knew better. I knew the value of stillness, the power of holding back. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, I thought, my eyes resting briefly on the black briefcase at my side. It's preparation. When the laughter died down, I simply finished my coffee, placed the cup back on its saucer, and looked at no one in particular. The performance was still going on around me, but the real act, mine, hadn't even begun. Outside, the night air was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of rain on the wind. My daughter and her friend stayed behind in the restaurant, lingering over dessert and another round of wine. I stepped onto the quiet sidewalk, my briefcase in hand, ready to walk the few blocks back to where I had parked. That's when my phone buzzed, the old, outdated one she had mocked so freely just an hour ago. I glanced at the screen and saw a familiar name. My personal banker. I answered with a low, "Good evening." His voice was crisp, professional, but there was a note of excitement beneath it. "So, I thought you'd want to know. The Forbes editorial team has just confirmed your profile. You'll be featured in the upcoming billionaire list. They'll be making the announcement at the charity gala next week." For a moment, I stood there in the dim glow of a street lamp, letting the words sink in. The corner of my mouth lifted into a quiet chuckle. Of all the weeks for this to happen, it had to be now, right after an evening spent as the butt of my daughter's dinner table humor. Timing, it seemed, had a sense of drama. We exchanged a few details, confirmation of figures, the logistics for the gala, my RSVP. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling the faint hum of anticipation settle in my chest. I had never cared much for public recognition, but sometimes the truth had a way of choosing its own stage. I thought back to her smirk, the easy way she'd offered to cover my coffee, the laughter that had echoed from her friends. I wasn't angry, not exactly. Disappointed, perhaps, but mostly, I was curious. Curious to see how her certainty would hold when the ground beneath it shifted. I decided, right there under that street lamp, that I wouldn't confront her in private. I wouldn't lecture her about respect, humility, or the dangers of judging someone by appearances. No, I would let the truth arrive on its own, uninvited, undeniable, and far more eloquent than any speech I could give. The gala would be perfect. She and her friends would be there, thinking it was just another free evening courtesy of poor old Dad's connections. And then the lights would turn, the cameras would flash, and the man she had written off would be introduced to the room, and to her, all over again. I tightened my grip on the briefcase, the leather warm under my fingers. The game was set, and I wouldn't need to raise my voice to win it. Back at home, the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. I set my briefcase down by the armchair and poured myself a glass of water, intending to forget the evening altogether. But curiosity has a way of pulling you toward the very thing you tell yourself to ignore. I unlocked my phone and opened Instagram, an app one rarely touched, but one I knew my daughter lived on. Her profile was lit with fresh updates, the glowing ring around her picture like a neon sign. I tapped it. The first video was from the restaurant, her perfectly manicured hand holding a wine glass, the camera sweeping over plates of lobster and glistening steak. Then it panned to me, sitting quietly with my coffee, my old phone resting on the table. Her caption read, "Dad living his best, budget life." A laugh track emoji looped beside it. The next clip caught the moment she announced to her friends, "I'll cover Dad's coffee. It's all he can afford." This one had drawn the most attention. Comments rolled in beneath it, each one more smug than the last. "Savage. Poor Dad. Literally." Strings of laughing emojis. I watched them in silence, feeling neither the sting they intended nor the shame they assumed. Instead, I felt an odd sort of detachment, as though I were watching a scene from a play I'd long since stepped out of. They were playing to their audience, not realizing the curtain would soon fall. I didn't comment. I didn't even open the message option. Instead, I took my time, pausing on each frame, capturing a screenshot of every clip and comment. Not for revenge, but for memory. Proof, perhaps, that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an accidental slip of the tongue. This was deliberate. When I closed the app, the room felt even quieter than before. The clock ticked on. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the branches against the window. I took a slow sip of water, my reflection faint in the glass. She thought she was telling a story tonight. She didn't know I was writing the ending. The envelope arrived the next morning, thick and cream-colored, with my name engraved in an elegant serif font. Inside, the invitation was embossed in gold, an exclusive charity gala at one of the city's most prestigious hotels. I knew the event well. It was the kind that drew politicians, business tycoons, and old money families who measured their worth not in words, but in influence. But this year, it would carry an added significance. Forbes had chosen it as the venue to announce the newest additions to their billionaire list. My name would be read aloud to the kind of audience that understood exactly what that meant. I turned the card over in my hands, feeling the raised edges of the lettering. This was the stage I'd been waiting for, not to boast, but to allow the truth to speak in a language my daughter could not dismiss as stories. When I called her later that afternoon, I kept my tone casual. "I have an extra invitation for a gala dinner next week," I said. "An old friend sent it my way. Thought you might want to come along. Maybe bring a couple of your friends." There was a pause on the line, the faint rustle of her flipping through something. Maybe her planner, maybe her mood. "What kind of dinner?" she asked, suspicion thinly veiled under indifference. "Oh, you know," I replied. "Charity event, fancy place, good food. Might be a fun evening out." I could almost hear her calculation on the other end, weighing the appeal of a high-end venue against the embarrassment of being seen with the man she'd mocked only days ago. In the end, luxury won. "All right," she said finally. "I'll come. I'll ask a couple of the girls too." "Perfect," I said, keeping my voice steady, almost bored. "It's formal attire, by the way. I'll send you the details." After we hung up, I placed the invitation on my desk, the gold catching a slant of sunlight from the window. She would walk into that ballroom expecting a free dinner and a night of indulgence at someone else's expense. What she didn't know was that the evening would be hazed to remember, not for the food, not for the music, but for the moment the truth walked out from behind the curtain. And this time, I wouldn't have to say a word. The room would do it for me. The evening of the gala arrived with the sky brushed in deep gold, the city lights just beginning to glow. My car, a sleek, chauffeur-driven sedan, pulled smoothly up to my building. The driver stepped out, opening the door with a quiet, professional nod. I adjusted the cuff of my custom-tailored suit, its fabric cool and precise against my skin, and felt the reassuring weight of the watch on my wrist, understated, but worth more than most cars on the street. When we reached my daughter's apartment, she and her two friends were already waiting at the curb. Their eyes flickered over the car first, then to me as I stepped out. I caught the faint crease of surprise on her forehead before she masked it with a shrug. "Nice, right?" one of her friends murmured, her tone careful. My daughter smirked, as if she'd already explained it to herself. "Probably borrowed," she whispered under her breath, not quite quietly enough. I didn't react. Instead, I gestured toward the open door. "Shall we?" The hotel greeted us in a hush of marble and chandeliers. It sent a mix of polished wood and something faintly floral. I moved easily through the lobby, shaking hands with the concierge, exchanging nods with two men in tailored tuxedos who addressed me by name. My daughter glanced between us, her expression tightening. At the entrance to the ballroom, a hostess smiled warmly. "Wonderful to see you again, Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice tinged with the kind of respect that isn't rehearsed. She handed me a program and gestured toward the front tables. "Your seats are ready." The three of them followed, their heels clicking against the marble, their eyes darting around at the glittering crowd. I could feel their unspoken questions, but they kept them tucked behind polite smiles. I pulled out a chair for my daughter, then took my own seat with the calm of someone who had been here many times before, because I had. Waiters greeted me without needing my name, a nod here, a quiet welcome back there. Every detail of the room, from the arrangement of the floral centerpieces to the pacing of the string quartet, felt familiar. They thought tonight was just a borrowed ticket to someone else's world. They didn't know it was my world. And soon, they would. The dinner had been in full swing for over an hour when the emcee, a tall man in a midnight blue tuxedo, stepped up to the podium. The soft hum of conversation dimmed, replaced by the faint shuffle of servers retreating to the edges of the room. The spotlight angled toward the stage, catching the gold in the draped curtains. "Ladies and gentlemen," the emcee began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Tonight, as part of our annual tradition, we celebrate not only generosity but achievement. And now, it's time to recognize one of this year's newest additions to the Forbes billionaires list." A ripple of anticipation swept through the tables. My daughter leaned toward her friend, clearly intrigued, whispering something I couldn't hear. The emcee smiled, drawing out the moment. "Please welcome, Mr. Daniel Hartley." The sound of my name in that room was like a match struck in the dark. My daughter's laughter, the same easy, careless laughter I'd heard so many times before, stopped mid-breath. Her wine glass hovered an inch from her lips. Across from her, one friend's jaw actually dropped. The other blinked in disbelief, glancing from me to the stage and back again as if trying to connect two entirely different people. The applause came first in polite bursts, then grew into something fuller, led with the flash of cameras and the low murmur of recognition. I rose slowly, buttoning my jacket, the light catching on my watch in a way I hadn't planned but didn't mind. As I walked to the stage, I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some calculating, some simply curious. The emcee shook my hand warmly, leaning in with a quiet, "Congratulations, sir." I stepped to the microphone, the applause fading into expectant silence. "I've never been one for speeches," I began, my voice steady, "but I do believe in moments. And this, tonight, is one of them. Not because of numbers or lists, but because it reminded me of something I learned a long time ago. You never truly know the weight someone carries, or the roads they've walked, just by looking at them." I paused, letting my eyes sweep the room, and, for the briefest moment, meeting my daughter's frozen gaze. "It's easy to measure people by what they display," I continued, "but the real worth of a person isn't worn on their wrist or parked in their driveway. It's in how they treat others when they think there's nothing to gain. Respect, like trust, is something you give freely, or you don't give it at all." There was no bitterness in my tone, no sharp edge, just the calm weight of truth. I smiled faintly. "So, I thank you for this recognition. But more importantly, I thank the people who taught me that appearances are just that, appearances. The truth will always speak for itself." Applause swelled again, warm and genuine. As I stepped away from the podium, the lights followed me back to my seat, and in their glow, my daughter looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. When I returned to the table, the air around it felt different. The lively chatter that had filled the space earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. My daughter sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the color drained from her face. She didn't meet my eyes, not once. Her friends, on the other hand, were anything but still. One had her phone out under the table, the glow from the screen lighting up her face in uneven flashes. The other leaned in, whispering urgently as they scrolled through search results. I caught fragments of their hushed conversation. "It's him. Look at this. Forbes, net worth, oh my God." I pretended not to notice. Instead, I turned my attention to the dessert that had been placed in front of me, a delicate chocolate tart with a glossy finish. I picked up my fork, cut a small piece, and let the richness melt slowly on my tongue. The ballroom hummed faintly with conversation again, but at our table, the weight of what had just happened was still sinking in. One of the friends glanced at me, then quickly looked away, as though afraid I might have heard every word they'd whispered about me before tonight. My daughter's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, twisting it into tight folds. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to explain, nothing to correct. The truth was already out there, splashed across their screens in neat, authoritative lines. My name, my history, my net worth, my picture. All verified, all undeniable. Every so often, the faint click of a camera from another table broke the quiet. But at ours, the silence was a far sharper sound. I took another bite of dessert, savoring it, letting the moment stretch. If there was an apology coming, I wasn't in a hurry to hear it. When the plates were cleared and the lights in the ballroom began to dim for the final performance of the evening, I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands loosely in my lap. My daughter still hadn't spoken. I could have filled the silence, but some lessons are better learned in the echo of your own thoughts. Tonight, the quiet was the teacher, and I was content to let it do the work. Outside the hotel, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. The valet pulled the car around, headlights sweeping across the pavement. My daughter lingered a step behind her friends, who were murmuring to each other, clearly eager to leave. She hesitated, then walked toward me, her heels clicking softly against the stone. "Dad." Her voice was quieter than I'd heard in years. She glanced down, then up again, struggling to hold my gaze. I didn't know. I never thought. I didn't mean. The words tangled in her throat, coming out in uneven bursts. She was reaching for an apology but tripping over the pieces of her own pride. I let her speak, not filling the gaps, not softening the weight of the silence between us. Finally, I said, "You don't need to explain." I looked at her, really looked at her, the way a craftsman studies a piece he's spent years shaping, only to see the cracks that time and carelessness have left. "But there's something you should understand." She shifted uncomfortably, her arms folding across her chest as if bracing herself. "Respect," I said evenly, "is free. It costs nothing to give. But once you lose it, it's expensive to earn back." Her eyes flickered, a mix of hurt and realization. I wasn't cruel in my tone, but I didn't bend it either. The words were steady, like setting a stone into place. "I'm not angry," I continued, "but I won't pretend it didn't matter. Tonight didn't change who I am, but maybe it showed you something about who you've been." She swallowed, looking away toward the line of cars. Her friends had already slipped into the back seat of the one waiting for them, glancing over curiously. The valet pulled my car to the curb. I nodded toward it. "Get in. I'll drop you home." She obeyed without another word, the conversation still hanging in the air like the faint scent of rain. There was no shouting, no dramatic ending, just the quiet line I had drawn. Whether she crossed it again was now her choice, not mine. By morning, the ripples had already begun to spread. My phone, the same outdated one she had marked, buzzed more times than usual. Messages from old acquaintances, former colleagues, and even distant relatives lit up the screen, each one a variation of "saw the news, congratulations." But I didn't need to check my own notifications to know the story had found its way online. The local news outlets had picked up the Forbes announcement, posting my photograph alongside a neatly condensed summary of my career. On social media, the headline made its rounds, shared by people who knew me and plenty who didn't. It didn't take long for the shift to reach my daughter's circle. Her mocking dinner clips, still fresh from just days ago, had started disappearing from her profile, one by one. A quick glance revealed that some of her closest friends had quietly unfollowed her. A few even left comments under my feature, calling my story inspiring and a reminder never to judge. The contrast was sharp. The same faces that had laughed at me over lobster and wine now reshaping their alignment, careful not to be caught on the wrong side of the narrative. For my daughter, the impact was more personal. I could tell from the way her own posts grew sparse, captions reduced to safe pleasantries, that she'd begun to understand just how far the echo of her words could carry, and how quickly it could turn against her. At a glance, it might have looked like nothing more than a shift in public mood. But I knew better. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was recalculating, realizing that her reputation, something she valued almost as much as her comfort, had taken a hit she couldn't easily erase. I didn't gloat. I didn't call to point it out. The lesson didn't need my voice. It was already there in every vanished clip, every lost follower, every friend who now tagged me in a post instead of her. Some truths don't need to be shouted to be heard. And in this case, the public had done the talking for me. Weeks passed before I called her. The air between us had cooled into something quiet. Not tense exactly, but still carrying the weight of all that had been left unsaid. I chose a Tuesday morning, ordinary, unremarkable, and asked if she'd meet me for coffee. The cafe was the same one where she had once leaned back in her chair, laughing with her friends, offering to cover my coffee as if it were an act of charity. The same worn wooden tables, the same faint scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. I arrived early, choosing a seat by the window. Sunlight spilled across the table, catching on the rim of my cup. When she walked in, I saw the difference immediately. Her steps were slower, her eyes softer. She was dressed neatly, but without the layers of showmanship she used to wear like armor. And in her hand, I noticed, was her own wallet. She smiled, small, careful. "Hi, Dad." I nodded toward the chair opposite mine. "Coffee's good here," I said, and she gave a short laugh, almost embarrassed. When the server came, she placed her order without glancing at me, then added, "And I'll get the bill." It was a simple gesture, but I understood the weight it carried. For a moment, we just sat there, the hum of the cafe wrapping around us. Then I leaned back, studying her face. "You know," I began, "wealth can buy comfort. It can open doors, make life easier. But dignity," I shook my head, "that you have to earn. And once you have it, it's worth more than anything in a bank account." She looked down, fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. "I understand," she said quietly. "I really do now." I let the silence linger, letting her words settle. Then I smiled, not unkindly. "Good. Because now, maybe we can talk about building something, not tearing people down." Her eyes lifted, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something there that had been missing. Not pride, not entitlement, but the beginnings of respect. We talked for a while longer, about small things mostly. The coffee cooled, the sunlight shifted, and eventually, we stood to leave. As we stepped out into the street, I thought about all that had happened. Money had been the stage for this lesson, but it hadn't been the point. Comfort can be bought. Respect can be lost. But dignity, the kind that stays with you when the applause fades, that earns you a peace no fortune can match,